I think what Biden is doing at the moment is unforgivable. He is sacrificing Israel at the altar of winning more votes in the presidential election. He is sacrificing Israel to the narrow cause of electoral calculation. That's essentially what he's doing. He's worried about losing the votes of some Arab Americans, and he's worried about losing the votes of so-called progressives, by which we mean, upper middle class graduate sections of American society who are the ones most likely to hate Israel. Further proof that university actually screws up people's minds and turns them into woke robots who think that a man can become a woman and Israel is the most evil state in history. So so what he's doing is he is slowly but surely betraying Israel. I think the line has been blurred so much that every time I hear someone saying they're anti-Zionist, I'm sorry, but I just think, oh, you're anti-Semitic. And the commonalities between these two things are so striking. Anti-Zionists will say that Israel is the most malignant state in the world and it exercises extraordinary power over Britain and America, and it's the kind of puppeteer of world affairs. It controls the media. It's uniquely bloodthirsty. The Zionist entity loves to kill children in particular. They love to target children. If all that sounds familiar, it's because that's exactly what anti-Semites used to say about the Jewish people.
Hello everybody and welcome to JTV. I'm so thrilled to be joined by a guest that's been on the show a few previous times on JTV, Brendan ONeill. Before I introduce Brendan and we begin this conversation, I saw this picture recently which a friend of mine posted. I've seen it a few times in the past, and this is of a German civilian in 1936 refusing to do the Nazi salute. And my friend posted this on Instagram, and he was saying, we all want to be this person, and we all think we are this person. But the truth is many, many people who think they are like that actually aren't. And actually, courage is not so common. Especially today, the courage to stand up against the tide of hysteria and insanity that we see kind of forced down our throats. It takes real bravery and courage to stand up and say, no, this is not right. To stand up against the mob at risk of your social crowd and your work and all these things. It's not so common. And Brendan ONeill, who's our guest today, is one of the most wonderful examples of someone that does have that kind of bravery and courage. And that's why I wanted to start with that picture, Brendan, because you and there's been a few others that have really come to light. It's multiplied. Your presence has sort of multiplied in the past few months since the great atrocity of October 7th and Israel's response. And you've been one of those, unfortunately, rare examples of people who are prepared to stand up to the mob and shine light in darkness. So thank you for doing that. And I've been looking at a lot of your work recently and your articles on Spiked online, and you're just doing this consistently. So thank you. Thank you for all you do. And I want to just jump into analysing what's been going on over the past few months since we last spoke. The interview that we did in the few weeks after the October 7th atrocity was based on your article in Spiked, where you said, why won't the Jews just let themselves be killed? And we're seeing it happen, this paradigm where the world just holds Israel to the most absurd standards that if Israel were to stick to them, they would simply fall. Israel would be eliminated. And we're seeing it happening again with this whole thing about Rafah and going into Rafah. The world's bizarre moral indignation at Israel's entry into Rafah. And it's exactly what you said in that article all those months ago. And you just put out another article recently about this, about, did we say the same thing with regard to our mission getting rid of ISIS? Can you talk to us about this reaction and how the world is treating Israel's necessary operation in Rafah?
Well, firstly, thank you for the introduction, Ollie. I appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Yes, I think the kind of things I said early on, which we talked about last time, which was basically the reaction to 7th of October was to tell Israel to lay down their arms, don't overreact, don't go into Gaza, basically roll over and let Hamas kill you. That's essentially what people were saying. What I've thought over the past few weeks is that climate has actually got worse. You think it might improve over the following months, but actually it's got worse. And the same thing is being said to Israel now in relation to Rafah. We know for a fact that Hamas is in Rafah. We know that they're using UNRWA compounds in Rafah as bases from which to organize themselves. We know that they are holding Israeli hostages there. We know that they are firing missiles from Rafah into Israel. Some of them have killed IDF soldiers, others have fallen on Israeli towns, and the intention there is obviously to slaughter Jewish people. So we know that Rafah is being used as a base for fascism, as a base for violence against the Jewish state, genocidal violence against the Jewish state. So the people telling the Jewish state not to go in there, not to get these people, essentially leave them alone. They're saying the same thing. They're saying, Jews, why don't you let yourselves be killed? What's the big deal? It's not the end of the world. So it's the same extraordinary double standard where Israel is expected to put up with a situation that no other state in the world would be expected to put up with, which is the existence on your doorstep of a genocidal army that is more than willing to kill your citizens and has already killed more than 1,000 of them over the past few months. So the demands being made of Israel by the self-righteous of the world, I find it really repulsive.
I do as well. And what do you say to those who say, well, yeah, no, I get that they've got to go after Hamas, but the civilian casualties they're just intolerable now. That's, we sometimes say, even people like Piers Morgan, who claims to be that voice of reason, I feel that sometimes he tries to be all things to all people, and many people say, well, I get that it's, I don't support October 7th, but come on, look what's happening in Gaza. It's just terrible.
Yeah, but even there, as you will be well aware, the double standards are through the roof, because we know, as a species, we know that every war has collateral damage. It's tragic, it's incredibly regrettable. But every single war that has ever been fought, and this goes back to before modernity, before the development of modern day weapons, even back to the American Civil War, the English Civil War, even in those wars, there were civilian casualties, there was collateral damage. This is something we've always known. It's a regrettable fact of war that civilians will die in the conflict between the opposing armies. And it's happened in every war of recent years, and it's happening in the Gaza war as well. The point I make is this war was started by Hamas. It was started by Hamas when they launched the worst act of anti-Jewish violence since the Holocaust, when they slaughtered more than 1,000 Israelis. They brought this war on themselves. They knew exactly what Israel's response would be. They knew Israel would go in there to hunt them down and to recover the hostages. So this is a war. The architects of this war are the fascists of Hamas. And that's the first thing we have to bear in mind. But, when people say things like, well, Israel has now killed more people than Hamas killed on the 7th of October, I find that such a juvenile argument. There is no moral comparison. There is no moral connection whatsoever between the killings carried out by Hamas on the 7th of October and the regrettable deaths of civilians in Israel's subsequent war against Hamas. Hamas purposely killed civilians. It targeted them. It killed them in the most intimate way by shooting them, throwing hand grenades into their safety shelters, stabbing them to death, in one case trying to behead people. It purposely set out on an orgy of racist violence to kill as many Jews as possible. What Israel has done is it's pursuing that terrorist movement, and regrettably, civilians are dying as a consequence, very often because Hamas hides behind civilians. It hides in civilian infrastructure, it hides behind civilian people. So the idea that there is any kind of moral comparison between these two events is just absolutely ridiculous. People have lost the ability to exercise moral clarity in relation to this war. If they had that ability, they would recognize that the war was started by Hamas. It's Hamas that is refusing to end the war by returning the hostages and surrendering to Israel. And all Israel is doing is fighting against a movement that killed its people and which threatens its very existence. This is a just war, and I think more people should be openly supporting Israel's efforts.
Absolutely. And I don't even buy in many cases that people are being genuine when they have indignation at the civilian casualties simply because of their double standards, that they don't seem to have a problem with the West wars, with other wars going on, certainly in our war against ISIS. And there certainly wasn't back-to-back coverage of every single attack or even IDF error or mistake. It's just mad. But I wonder, I've been trying to grapple with how we combat this juvenile moral compass that we see so many, especially even at the great, highly esteemed Western universities, these people seeming to have. It's how is it that some people are just unable to understand basic logic, that you can't just think with your heart, you have to think as an adult and also with your head, and to understand that sometimes war is just. Like, do you have any sense? Have you made any progress in understanding how we can tackle this? It's almost like a bit of a mind virus where people just can't open their moral and intellectual horizons.
Yeah, it's because they've been completely morally corrupted by Israelophobia. Their hatred for Israel is astonishing to me. And I say this as someone who's been writing about the left's irrational hatred for Israel for quite some time, for many years, 20 years, I think. But I'm still shocked at how intense it has become since the 7th of October. They hate Israel with an unusual passion, and often a quite bigoted passion. The way they talk about Israel very frequently crosses the line from criticizing a state to slamming an entire people as being psychotic and in the grip of genocidal mania and an evil state that doesn't even deserve to exist. There's an extraordinary level of bigotry to their hatred for Israel. But their minds are so polluted by hatred for this one state, which happens to be the world's only Jewish state. Their minds are so polluted by hatred for it that they can't see clearly. They're incapable of cool deliberation. They're incapable of moral judgment or moral analysis. They're incapable of any of that. And instead, they have this visceral response to everything Israel does. And I think last time we talked about how everything Israel does is now considered a war crime, is now considered an act of genocide. So if Israel tells civilians in Gaza to move away from a certain area because it's going to be fighting Hamas there, even that is now considered genocide. It's the genocidal act, supposedly, of forced removal, when, of course, what Israel is really doing is trying to protect civilian life from the war that it has to fight with the fascists of Hamas. So even when Israel takes efforts to save people in Gaza from being injured or killed, even that becomes a genocidal act. I mean, this is Kafkaesque levels of dishonesty that we're seeing. And it all springs, I think, from this extraordinary demonization of Israel as a uniquely barbarous state. The Guardian columnist Owen Jones referred to Israel's campaign in Gaza as uniquely murderous. And you do start to wonder, what do they mean by this? What are they trying to say? They single Israel out as the worst state that has ever existed. I mean, that is how some people see it. And I think that is a very dangerous idea to take. And it seems completely inevitable to me that when people devote themselves to hating the Jewish state, that some of those people are going to cross the line and start hating the Jewish people. And that's what we've seen over the past few months.
Yeah, and it's funny because for years, even when I was at school and we saw the earlier operations in Gaza, 2009, 2012, whenever they were, 2014, I remember speaking to my non-Jewish friends who weren't super, well-read on the conflict. And they're trying to find out, hold on, is there really a legitimate grievance against Israel? Is this just demonization? What is it? And I said, just, even if you didn't know much about the conflict, before you dive in, just consider, given that there's been a 3,000-year-old story of Jew hatred that has been consistent, it's been irrational, it's been intense, it's manifested all over the place, and it culminated in living memory in the worst genocide. It created the term genocide, anti-Semitism, with the Holocaust. Is it conceivable? Is it possible that maybe the obsession, the unique evil that they describe about Israel is something to do with that hatred rather than about some kind of legitimate grievance against Israel. And and it's just any objective person should be able to see that. But this leads me on then to one of your recent articles about Biden, because we've spoken about how, yes, there's many people who are students and just, members of the public that may have a juvenile moral compass. But unfortunately, as you seem to write, this seems to also be in the rooms of high power in America as well. How do we make sense of what's happened here?
I think what Biden is doing at the moment is unforgivable. He is sacrificing Israel at the altar of winning more votes in the presidential election. He is sacrificing Israel to the narrow cause of electoral calculation. That's essentially what he's doing. He's worried about losing the votes of some Arab Americans, and he's worried about losing the votes of so-called progressives, by which we mean, upper middle class graduate sections of American society who are the ones most likely to hate Israel. If you look at polls, it's very interesting. The people with a degree, a university degree, are likely to be more hostile to Israel than people without a university degree. So further proof that university actually screws up people's minds and turns them into woke robots who think that a man can become a woman and Israel is the most evil state in history. So yes, so what he's doing is he is slowly but surely betraying Israel. He is throwing it under the bus, and we can see it in different ways. He's said to Israel, if you go into Rafah, if you go all out into Rafah, we will stop providing you with certain weapons. He said Israel hasn't crossed the red line yet, but it's getting close to it. He's making noises and making moves that are designed to isolate Israel, and he's doing it entirely for electoral gain. This is such geopolitical idiocy. He's not thinking clearly about what is in America's own geopolitical interests, which is to hold at bay the anti-Semitic forces that surround Israel. We all have a shared interest, I believe. Those of us who value Western civilization have a shared interest in standing with Israel against these anti-Semitic armies. But he's not thinking like that. All he can think about is, how am I going to get back into the White House? It's such a narrow way of thinking about the world. So what he's doing is really unforgivable. And you can see echoes of it in Britain as well. Lord David Cameron, the foreign secretary no one really wants, where the hell did he come from? He's also making noises that are quite isolating, I think, towards Israel. He hasn't said that Britain will cut off arms supplies. That's good. And he has made some recent comments in which he said, look, we can't let Hamas win. But he has taken measures and said things that I think are designed to punish Israel or to reprimand Israel before the eyes of the world. And you just think to yourself, okay, number one, that's a really stupid thing for Britain to do, geopolitically speaking, diplomatically speaking. And number two, you're the man who led the invasion of Libya, which was a complete and utter disaster, which destabilized vast swathes of northern Africa, which led to the re-emergence of ISIS in Africa, which led even to the re-emergence of slave markets under ISIS's watch in parts of northern Africa, in parts of northern Arab Africa. The idea that Israel should take lectures from you, David Cameron, about how it should execute this just war against the terrorists that slaughtered its citizens, I find that completely laughable. So I don't like, you're right. We didn't really expect more from students and activists and the woke left. We knew that they hated Israel, although I am shocked at the intensity of their hatred and the speed with which it has crossed the line to something much more bigoted. But from Western politicians, I think what we're seeing is quite surprising and deeply, deeply concerning. And if they had any sense of their own nation's security and the importance of keeping the world safe from Islamo-fascists, they would be much more on the side of Israel than they currently are.
Absolutely. And you said in an article a few months ago, when Israel accidentally hit a few aid workers, which, by the way, these kinds of accidents and friendly fire happen, sadly, tragically, often in conflict, even ones that the West have fought. You were saying that Western politicians, including people like Cameron, use Israel as a way of laundering their own moral and political reputations, but, attack them so they can seem, on high morally. I also think, by the way, this even occurs in Europe and the post-Holocaust guilt. Howard Jacobson said that Europe never forgave the Jews the Holocaust, and they attack Israel and make Israel the new Nazis, which is the most perverse and grotesque accusation given the context of Israel's creation. But they do that in order to get rid of that guilt that they can't bear. Do you want to just talk a bit about that and the psychology behind like laundering one's own moral reputation?
Yeah, it's become increasingly clear to me that the anti-Israel movement is not an anti-war movement. And it's certainly not an anti-imperialist movement in the way that we might have understood them in the past. This is a movement that actually is calling on the Western powers to punish Israel. It's a demand for the exercise of Western power against this uppity little Jewish state in the Middle East. It's actually a very imperious movement. And I've seen left-wing activists on the streets, and I've seen some of those student rebels, so-called student rebels, saying, when is the West going to do something? When are we going to enforce sanctions on Israel? When are we going to, somebody even saying, why don't we invade them? Why don't we send United Nations armed forces into Israel and teach it a lesson? This is a pro-war movement. This is not like the anti-war movement of the 1960s around Vietnam. This is not even like the anti-war movement in relation to Iraq in 2003. This is a pro-war movement. It's pro-war in the sense that it is very sympathetic to Hamas, the movement that started this war. And it's also pro-war in the sense that it is demanding that the Western powers throw their weight around in relation to Israel and teach it a lesson. And then that then rubs off on politicians. I think some of them spy an opportunity to launder their reputations, through posturing against Israel. It's the speediest way to the moral high ground amongst a certain influential section of society. The best way to get those votes from so-called progressives that you want, or to win a few brownie points from up-and-coming students who will soon be in the media and in the political class, the way to get brownie points from those people is to say, Israel is a bit out of control. Israel needs to get its act together. Israel needs to stop killing aid workers and so on. So they spy an opportunity to rehabilitate their own moral standing in the world by attacking Israel. And that's most clear with David Cameron. You know, you're absolutely right. In every war in recent times, there has been friendly fire where people have accidentally killed people on their side. So in Libya, for example, there were so many friendly fire incidents that the pro-West rebels, the people on our side, had to paint the roof of their vehicles bright pink in order that NATO might not drop bombs on them. In Afghanistan, during the Afghanistan war, there were so many attacks on weddings that NATO forces often mistook weddings for gatherings of Al-Qaeda and Taliban militants. There were so many attacks on weddings that the leaders of Afghanistan pleaded with Obama to stop bombing these family events. And they killed scores and scores of women and children in these bombing attacks. And who was Obama's deputy president? Joe Biden. So for people like Joe Biden and David Cameron to get on their high horse and wag a finger at Israel because it made that mistake of bombing the aid workers, I just find it grotesquely hypocritical and actually quite sick-making. And the fact that it's lapped up by all these supposed radical leftists who are cheering on the Western imperial powers as they tell off this state in the Middle East, I find that hypocritical too. So yeah, a lot of people are using Israel as a way of rehabilitating their own reputations or demonstrating their virtue to the in-group in society. And to use a state like Israel in that way is unforgivable. This is a state under attack, under siege by Iran, by Hezbollah, by the Houthis, by Hamas, by the enemies of Western civilization. And we should be on its side rather than using it as a soapbox to make a display of our own supposed virtue.
Absolutely. Do you think behind the scenes, many of these Western politicians feel different to what they're saying on screen?
I would like to think so, but I'm not sure that that's true. It's hard to tell. You know, for the most part, the West is still kind of on Israel's side, although I do think that's starting to weaken, and that's something that's very, very worrying. But I do think that even Western politicians, I mean, they're not immune to the trends in our society. That's just the way it goes. You know, they're not immune to the anti-civilizational trends that we've seen growing up over the past decade and more, the anti-Westernism that we've seen in our societies, this view of the West as just basically a criminal enterprise, and British history and American history is just empire and slavery and colonialism, and we have to tear down the old statues and rename the old streets. And that culture of self-loathing that we see in so many institutions and in universities and in schools and in popular culture, the political class is not immune to it. They do sometimes try to take a stand against it, and some of them do it quite successfully, like Kemi Badenoch, for example, and a few others. But they're not immune to these regressive cultural trends. And what that means, I think, is that when you have a war that is very clearly a war between civilization and barbarism, a war between a democratic state defending its right to exist and an anti-Semitic army that wants to kill all Jews, that is a conflict that ought to have put pressure on everyone in the West to put a flag in the ground and say, okay, enough's enough. Playtime is over. We have to stand with civilization against barbarism. We have to stand with Israel against Hamas. We have to stand with the Jewish people against the people who want to kill them. We know that the left failed that moral test. We know that lots of movers and shakers in the cultural world failed that moral test. I think it's possible that some in the political class are struggling to succeed on that moral question. They're struggling to keep their principles together and to keep standing with Israel in this very important clash of civilizational values. So the more they weaken, I think the more trouble we're in. So that there really is an onus, I think, on people like us to keep making the case that Israel has to win this war, for both for its own sake and also for the sake of the West as well.
Absolutely. And do you think, I mean, there's been some conversation internally in Israel and among many Jewish people and Israel supporters that it seems that it's not always that Israel has American support, although she certainly does enjoy that in terms of many people in Congress and often with presidents, but not always. But is there an argument to say that actually it seems it's less support and more dependence, and perhaps Israel needs to rethink her military strategy in terms of reliance on America, and maybe I don't know what that would look like in terms of rethinking it, because I mean, where are they going to go instead? But have you had any thoughts on this issue?
It's such a difficult question, isn't it? Because instinctively, I think you're absolutely right that it would be better if Israel were to go it alone. I don't mean completely on its own. It needs as much international solidarity as it can get. But I do think it has to, I think probably coming out of this current moment, Israel will ask itself, who can we really rely on? Who are our real friends? I think it needs to have that conversation with itself. You know, the problem for Israel is that it is under siege. It's under siege in the region from terrorist forces that want to destroy it. But it's also under a kind of intellectual siege or a moral siege by the influential sections of society in the West. So there's this kind of double siege of Israel, firstly by literal militants who want to kill Jewish people, but then also by Western activists and intellectuals who've lost their faith in Western society, and they often pin the blame for that on Israel. They often take it out on Israel. They hold Israel up as the the kind of defining emblem of this rotten Western civilization, and they kind of express all their fury against Israel. So Israel is under a double siege, and it really needs as much support as it can get. I think rather than cutting ties with America or Britain following our creeping betrayal of Israel, what Israel ought to do is look to those societies in terms of who in those societies is still willing to support us. Who in Britain and America is still on our side? What political actors or ordinary citizens might we be able to talk to, engage with, explain to the seriousness of the situation, because those people are out there. There are many people in America and Britain, Jewish and non-Jewish, who are still very interested in supporting Israel and who recognize the importance of its defeating of Hamas. So I think Israel probably needs to have a serious conversation with itself about who its friends are, but also needs to think about how to make new friends and where they might come from, in order that it can fortify itself against the siege at home and also the siege from abroad.
Absolutely. Completely agree. And I think, and try to be as much as they can as independent as possible, so they can, if they need to, go it alone as well, because it's very risky having such high levels of dependence. I want to also touch on what we're seeing on campuses and among these students. I was shown recently an email sent by a senior, I don't know whether it's the president or someone senior at Penn University, UPenn. And because there had been an incident, and it was a detailed email talking about the incident that occurred and their action plan to deal with it and their concern for all the students' well-being. And what was it about? It was because 6 LGBT stickers had been removed from a library desk. And you contrast that with the literal, explicit, genocidal calls that have been made by students towards Israel, towards Jews, and even to Jewish students. I even saw a poster that said, I think this was at UCLA. I'll see if I can get it up here, because it's so fascinating, as you say, to see the ridiculous double standards. But have a look at this. So this was, I believe, at UCLA, and it said, Israelis are native to hell. Now, this is not the Israeli government or Benjamin Netanyahu or the IDF, not that would make it much better, but it's Israelis. Now, imagine if they said it's Russians. Russians go to hell because of what Putin's doing. They don't do that. And you said earlier that it's crossed the line. It's become now so explicit. Could you just reflect on that and just elaborate on that? Because I agree with you, but I don't think it's hit everyone yet, just how explicit the Jew hatred has become.
Yeah, but and just look at the campus protests, as you say. That's where you can see it most explicitly, I think. If you want to see it, obviously some people don't want to see it. But if you look at what they said on American campuses, there was one placard in the center of the encampment at Columbia University in New York, which referred to Israel as the pigs of the earth. Now, if anyone tries to tell me that that's anti-Zionism, not anti-Semitism, I'm going to give them a slap. Because if you're referring to the Jewish state as the pigs of the earth, you are a racist. You are an anti-Semite. There is no question about that whatsoever. And we saw many such expressions in Columbia and other encampments where we heard actual racist invective. We heard people saying to Jews, go back to Poland. We saw one incident where a young woman at Columbia was holding up a sign saying Hamas's next targets, with an arrow pointing at a group of Jewish students. So basically saying, Hamas, come and kill these Jews. So explicit anti-Semitism has been very apparent on these campus protests. And then look at their chants. They've been chanting on some of these in America, we don't want no two states, we want all of it. And they also have chanted, we don't want two states, we want 48. Now, that's, of course, a reference to the time before the existence of the modern state of Israel. And so they want to get rid of Israel. These are the kind of people who complain about ethnic cleansing, but they want to ethnically cleanse Israel. They want to get the Jews out of there, get Israel off the map entirely, and hand it over to a people who, unfortunately, right now are governed by either actual outright anti-Semitic lunatics or by Fatah, which is not much better and is corrupt and undemocratic and pretty useless. So they want to take Israel off the Jewish people and hand it to those forces. So this is an explicit cry for the erasure of the Jews from their homeland, for the destruction of the Jewish homeland, and in some instances for the removal of the Jews from that part of the world entirely. That is racism. That's all there is to it. There's no other way to describe it but as anti-Semitism. And it seems to me that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are now virtually indistinguishable. And I say this as someone, I used to argue maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that of course you can be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. You can make a moral, ideological argument against Zionism if that's what you want to do. I just don't think that's possible anymore. I think the line has been blurred so much that every time I hear someone saying they're anti-Zionist, I'm sorry, but I just think, oh, you're anti-Semitic. And the commonalities between these two things are so striking. Anti-Zionists will say that Israel is the most malignant state in the world, and it exercises extraordinary power over Britain and America, and it's the kind of puppeteer of world affairs. It controls the media. It's uniquely bloodthirsty. The Zionist entity loves to kill children in particular. They love to target children. If all that sounds familiar, it's because that's exactly what anti-Semites used to say about the Jewish people, that they were malignant, they were a pox on humanity, they puppeteered global politics, they had extraordinary amounts of power, they were bloodthirsty, they killed children, of course, they sacrificed children in order to drink their blood. All the things that used to be said about the Jewish people are now said about the Jewish nation. There has been a projection of anti-Semitism onto anti-Zionism, and the line between them has become blurred to being almost invisible. And I just say to people now, if you think the Jewish state is uniquely barbarous and loves targeting children and is a malignant force in global politics, then you are very, very similar, if not the exact same, as the anti-Semites who used to say that about the Jewish people. So I think we have to be much more, confrontational with these people and say to them, of course, it's not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. Israelis do it all the time, but that's not what you're doing. What you're doing is hating Israel with an unusual and freakish passion, calling for its destruction and demonizing it as a uniquely wicked state among the nations of the earth. And that crosses the line from criticism of a government to hatred of a people. And there's no question about that.
Absolutely. And I actually think that that's the point you're making, that, maybe 15 years ago, you might have had a bit more time for it. You're totally right. Like, the line's becoming so blurry now, but it's also because it's like they've reached a tipping point where now there's been enough time passed, perhaps since the Holocaust, where it was like it was being incubated behind the Palestinian cause. I wanted to bring up a quote by Inat Wolf. She said, "We're reaching a tipping point where the actual situation of real Palestinians will cease to matter, as Palestinianism will have served its purpose as the mask behind which the 75-year incubation, growth, and global unleashing of ideas, illegitimate after World War II, could take place." And I think that's what we're seeing happening. And also, not just I'm just anti-Zionist, I'm not anti-Semitic. I also think that applies to when people say, but it's not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. Now, look, I have my critique of Israel's strategy. There's all kinds of things that I think could be done differently. They're not moral critiques; they're just strategic critiques. But I think for the people who are criticizing Israel's cause of war, of going to war right now, that is anti-Semitic, because you're basically saying that you don't believe Israel needs to do what she does simply to survive, and that's been the theme of many of our discussions, right? So I don't even have time for that anymore when people say, "But I'm just criticizing." Don't you're just shutting down free speech.
Yeah, a lot of these people are just pissed off that it's a lot harder to kill Jews than it used to be. That's really what's going on here. And when they say don't go to war with Hamas, don't go into Rafah, don't go into Gaza at all, just and accept responsibility for the 7th of October. That's the other thing they say. They say that Israel is responsible for the 7th of October because it's been oppressing the Palestinian people and so on for so long, and they were bound to fight back at a certain point. That's what the students at Harvard University said in hours after the 7th of October. They said all the violence is the fault of Israel. That's just victim blaming. That is anti-Semitic too. The idea that the Jews brought it on themselves with their pesky behavior. Where have we heard that before? So, yeah, I think a lot of this is anti-Semitic at root. And of course, when you say that to some of these activists, they look at you as if you're mad because they think they're anti-racist. They think they're anti-fascist. What we've discovered since 7th of October is that they're not. These are the kind of people, as you say, there was a lot of campus insanity over the past few years where everything was considered racist. A white man wearing his hair in dreadlocks was racist. It was cultural appropriation. Or asking someone, where are you from? Apparently that was a racial microaggression. There was a real moral panic about racism on campuses. There was also a moral panic about sexism. Everything was defined as rape culture. If a young man asked a young woman, said, I think you're sexy, can I buy you a drink? That was seen as this terrible instance of patriarchal violence. That's what they've been saying on campuses for the past few years. And yet, when actual fascists attacked and killed Jews on the basis of their race, these same people supported them or made excuses for them. When actual fascists raped and butchered and kidnapped women in the most misogynistic way imaginable, these same people made excuses for them or justified it or said, well, what do you expect if you have a music festival next to a so-called concentration camp? The very people who've been posing as anti-sexist and anti-racist and anti-fascist for the past few years have thrown their lot in with one of the most violent, racist and misogynistic movements on earth. So their moral authority has completely and utterly collapsed. And I think it's really important that we just point that out whenever we get the opportunity, remind people what's at stake in this conflict, and remind them that if you really are on the side of being against racism, being against anti-Semitism, on the side of women, on the side of democracy, on the side of people's right to live in peace, then you ought to be on Israel's side, not Hamas's.
Yeah. They are what they accuse Israel of. I think that's been one of the most remarkable realizations. We put out a video actually just recently where I went through every single accusation leveled against Israel: apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, dehumanizing the other side, acting like Nazis. And literally, that is precisely what the Arab jihadist eliminationist cause is guilty of in every single case. I think a lot of it just comes down to a very simple equation, and this for me determines how someone views the whole conflict. Is, do you see the Palestinian cause ultimately as a cause of legitimate grievance, or is it manufactured based on a hateful ideology? And whichever camp one is more sympathetic to, that's basically how all your views will flow from that. And so it seems it's clear, certainly from my study of history analysis, that it has been from the start, from the get-go, about an inability to accept any idea of Jewish sovereignty or self-determination, and the national cause of the self-described Palestinians. Quite simply, if you were to ask any Palestinian activist or leader, past or present, would you prefer A, free Palestine from the river to the sea, but one tiny Jewish town as self-autonomy and self-determination, or B, let's say Syria takes control of all the land, but no free Palestine, no self-determination, no national identity and government, or some other Islamic empire comes and they'd choose the latter. So it's not about nationalism, really. It's about the Dar al-Islam. It's about the dishonor of a former dhimmi re-establishing. And there's all kinds of theological shifts that are going to need to take place in the Arab world to make space for this idea that there can be a Jewish people with their own self-determination, and that aren't going to, haven't been forsaken by God and forever condemned to wander the earth. And we're seeing the Christian world who, hundreds of years ago in Europe, Jews shuddered often when they heard the word Christian. There was a huge amount of oppression which flowed from, I think a lot of it flowed from a theological attitude towards the Jews. And I think that's where a lot of the shift is going to have to take place. I'm curious to know what you thought about a recent Republican House bill to send students to Gaza as those who are, guilty of acts of violence or criminality on campuses. I wonder what you made of that.
I thought it was quite funny. I'm generally against forcing people to go overseas against their will. I'm against forcing anyone to do anything against their will, of course. But I did find it quite humorous because, when I think of movements like Queers for Palestine, for example, and you just think to yourself, look, if you guys went to Palestine, it's game over. That's that, you know, I saw someone say that if these Queers for Palestine went to Palestine, their pronouns would be was, were, and you think, yeah, that's actually accurate. That is what would happen pretty quickly. But that's indicative of something that you were saying earlier, which is that amongst these Western activists, the Palestinian cause, as they call it, has increasingly little to do with Palestine, if anything at all. It's become a cause for Westerners themselves. They firstly, they don't have any historical understanding of the region. They don't have any understanding of the history of Israel, both the ancient history and the modern history. They don't understand the process of liberation that Israel went through in the 1940s in order to regain its old homeland and create a modern state. They don't understand any of this at all, or they just poo-poo it as propaganda from Zionists, etc. You know, Palestine for them has become just a buzzword. It's a means of virtue signaling. So if you look at the way in which they all wear the keffiyeh, for example, that's become the garment through which you demonstrate your virtue to other members of the in-group. It's not solidarity as we would traditionally have understood it. You know, I don't remember students on American campuses wearing those pointy hats that Vietnamese peasants wear when they were protesting
By the
against the
way, you know the
Vietnam.
keffiyeh was a British colonialist
Yeah,
creation.
exactly. So there's another layer of irony to all of this, which is that the keffiyeh has its own colonial origins, but it's like it's fancy dress politics. It's they kind of they're supposed to be against cultural appropriation, but they've culturally appropriated the keffiyeh. They're trying to culturally appropriate what they see as Palestinian suffering and Palestinian pain, which is why we had those very privileged activists on Columbia University saying, we're starving, we need water, we need humanitarian aid, and, you know, images of them getting aid through the school gates, which was basically their Starbucks order, you know, or a blueberry muffin or something. So
But it was
they're
almost like they were
mimicking.
envious of like
Yeah,
the sympathy of the Gazans. Like it's sick.
yeah, they're envious of what they see as Palestinian victimhood, because victimhood is the currency of our times. The way
Yeah.
in which you make an impact on the national stage, in political life, in media life, is by playing the victim card. And that's what these people are trying to do. These are very, very privileged people at the highest seats of learning on earth. They have lives of extraordinary comfort, and they pull on the keffiyeh in order to feel a little less white, a little less bourgeois, a little less privileged. They're literally appropriating what they consider to be the oppression of the Palestinian people. They crave the rush of oppression, the moral thrill of feeling like victims. So it's an entirely self-serving, narcissistic crusade dressed up as solidarity, 1960s style solidarity. So they've completely appropriated the so-called Palestinian cause and used it to make a case about themselves. So when they put on the keffiyeh, they're not trying to draw attention to Gaza. They're trying to draw attention to themselves. Look at me. Look how hyper aware I am. Look how good I am. That's what they're saying. So I look at this as the kind of double racism of this movement. So we know about the racism of their intense hatred for the Jewish state, but there's also the racism of their exploitation of the Palestinian cause and their exploitation of Arabs in order to gain a bit more meaning in their own lives. And, you know, they reduce Arabs to basically the level of non-entities who must soothe the white guilt of rich students at Columbia University. So there's a double racism going on here. I think neither, obviously Israelis don't benefit from this nonsense, but neither do Palestinians. Their lives are made measurably worse by the phony solidarity of Western activists, because that phony solidarity lends credence to Hamas, which makes the lives of ordinary Gazans much worse, because Hamas is a cruel, oppressive force. So this Palestinian solidarity is bad for everyone: Jews, Arabs, Israelis, Palestinians, and that's why we need to call it out.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you say that a lot of it stems from a void of meaning in their lives. And I would never ever say that the Jews are responsible for this, but I definitely, one of our messages on JTV has been, I feel that one positive thing the Jewish people should be doing, as people who have inherited an incredible collective and inherited wisdom, should try and bring a bit more of the wisdom that we love and enjoy on to the rest of the world, because we do need to try and find positive things that people can attach to and strive for in terms of finding meaning in their lives, rather than these absurd ultra woke moral paradigms. So, but that's just a side point, because that's really one of the things that really motivates everything we do on JTV. I want to two final questions. I want to talk about what happened at Eurovision, because that's interesting. Because on the one hand, we saw Eden Galan, who produced this really beautiful piece. I found it really moving, actually, about which was really a testimony to what happened on October 7th. And we saw some booing in the crowds, and we saw Greta Thunberg and her lot outside protesting Israel. But then on the other hand, we saw that Israel won the popular vote in the UK and came fifth throughout Europe. So it made me wonder about, like, what does the average person in Europe really make of Israel? And I wonder what your reflections were.
Yeah, I was struck by the same thing. You know, we know that the activist class loves to hate Israel. That's a given. So it wasn't surprising to see Greta Thunberg there with her keffiyeh on and everything like that. You know, by the way, this is a young woman who has talked about the bullying of women who are in the public eye. And then she's part of this protest, which was basically a mass act of bullying against a 20-year-old Israeli singer. It was so grotesque. You know, Ms. Golan couldn't even leave her hotel room at a certain point because there were so many threats against her life. And for Greta Thunberg to be part of that mob, I think was pretty sickening. But yeah, you're right. You know, that hostility was only to be expected. But ordinary people in Europe seem to have tried to register their disdain for those people by voting for Israel. I mean, that's what I did. And I know lots of other people who did it too. And then there are lots of ordinary people out there who did the same thing. I think they're probably quite sickened by the bullying of the Israeli singer. And I think they're probably increasingly irritated by the anti-Israel hysteria of the cultural elites. I think that's what some people are feeling. I mean, I wouldn't want to get ahead of myself on this, because I still do think there is a problem, certainly amongst the elites, but probably in sections of society as well, where there is, I would say, insufficient support for Israel. And people, I think lots of people still don't appreciate what is at stake in this conflict. So I wouldn't want to go too far down the optimistic road. But I do think it's quite interesting that where hating Israel is an absolute obsession of the upper echelons of society, it isn't amongst other sections of society. So that's something positive to hold on to. But I think, you know, the negative, of course, is that what was done at Eurovision was absolutely repulsive. Those protests were horrendous. And again, the double standard is just extraordinary. You know, you had all these British drag queens and these British LGBTQ activists saying, we're not watching Eurovision this year, we're closing down our gay pubs, we refuse to engage with it because of Israel is there. These are the same people who said nothing whatsoever about Britain's involvement in 2003, when we launched a pretty disastrous war in Iraq, or when we were engaged in the Afghan conflict, or when we were engaged in the Libyan conflict, all of which had pretty disastrous consequences for huge numbers of people. And in fact, I would go, your listeners and viewers will have a whole range of views on those wars, but it seems pretty unquestionable to me that British forces are responsible for larger numbers of deaths in the Middle East over the past 20 years, whether one thinks it's justifiable or not, than Israel is. It's unquestionable. And yet these British drag queens up on their moral high horses and other members of the kind of fashionable set were saying, well, we can't possibly watch Eurovision now that Israel's involved, whereas they were boogieing in their pubs to the naff entries that Britain sent over the past 20 years. Extraordinary double standards. And it comes down to, it's fundamentally a racial double standard. It fundamentally is about saying, well, we in Britain, we're a civilized country. It doesn't matter if we launch the occasional disastrous military campaign. We're fundamentally civilized. We're a good country. We are morally correct. We're morally upstanding. But Israel, that questionable little state, we can't have anything to do with that. So again, it comes down to that racial double standard. So yes, there is a lot to be positive about in terms of the public pushback against Israelophobia that we saw at Eurovision. But I think it also really revealed that the Israelophobia of the elites is, if anything, intensifying and really needs to be challenged on all fronts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the final question I want to ask, which really ties into that, and much of our discussion, is just taking our eye off Israel for a second, but just looking at the West, because a lot of issues that have been bubbling under the surface that we've kind of been sleepwalking through kind of came into focus in the post-October 7th world in the West, and certainly in the UK. And let's take the UK. That we've seen, the recent re-election of George Galloway, who is one of the most repulsive anti-Semitic politicians in Britain, but he's also very dangerous because he's he has apparently has charisma and is very good with rhetoric. We saw that Green Party councillor recently elected, shouting Allahu Akbar and this is for Gaza. We just saw a few days ago the police foiling a terror plot on a synagogue in North England. Do you think Britain and the West is starting to wake up? And I'm not so sure. And what's it going to take for the West to get a grip? And will we?
I hope it doesn't take anything bad for the West to get a grip, but that is one of the fears I have. I do think some people are probably waking up to how serious a situation this is, but I think others probably need more of a jolt. And that does concern me, because you think, how far are you willing to let this crisis go before you start to take it seriously? How far are you willing to let anti-Semitism go before you say something about it? And, the silence on the left about the surging anti-Semitism we've seen in Europe over the past 7 months or so is horrendous. These are the people who pose as anti-racist, and some of them have said nothing at all about the firebombing of a synagogue in Berlin, for example, or the daubing of swastikas on houses in Jewish homes in Paris, or, as you say, the alleged terror plot against Jews in the north of England. They're not saying anything about this stuff because it doesn't fit with their current narrative, which is that Israel is the biggest problem in the world. The Jewish people are a privileged people, and they are only capable of oppression, not of being oppressed. So it doesn't fit in with their narrative. They can't compute it, so they just leave it alone. These are the kind of people who love to fantasize about the Battle of Cable Street of the 1930s and how they would have been on the side of the working classes, the Jews and other members of the working classes who clubbed together to stand up against Oswald Mosley's fascists. They love to think they would have been on the right side of that conflict. But many cable streets are happening every day right now. We've seen Jews being harassed and attacked in London and other parts of the country. We've seen those hate marches, those kind of supposedly pro-Palestine marches, but really pro-Hamas marches, where we've seen open declarations of anti-Semitism, open displays of jihadist chanting and so on. And where is this left who thinks they would have been on the right side of Cable Street? They're on the other side. They're on the side of the anti-Semitic forces. They're either rubbing shoulders with them or making excuses for them or turning a blind eye to their violent behavior against Jewish people. So we now know what side they would have been on in Cable Street, and it's not the side they think. So much about these people has been exposed in recent months. And I think it's so important to really take a clear stand against anti-Semitism. It is not only a form of racism, and racism should always be opposed in every form that it takes, but the return of anti-Semitism is always indicative of a deeper moral rot in society. It always points to a corrosion of Enlightenment values, a corrosion of the virtues that we used to hold on to, a real resurgence of regressive thinking, medieval thinking, anti-modern thinking. The return of anti-Semitism always expresses those deeper, visceral trends, and that's what's happening right now. So there is a double interest in challenging anti-Semitism. First, Jewish people have the right to live in peace without persecution or discrimination. And second, in order to repair our societies, we have to start by confronting this hatred that has got a new lease of life since the 7th of October. So we need more voices on our side standing up against these new haters and putting the case for freedom, enlightenment, and the right of Jewish people and the Jewish state to live in peace.
We really do. And I have no doubt that the work you're doing and the impact that you have and the voice that you have empowers others to do the same. Brendan, thank you for your analysis over this interview and ongoing analysis through all your work, your eloquence, and for your bravery. It's really greatly appreciated. And I love speaking to you every time we have the chance to. I know our viewers really appreciated it as well. So just ongoing gratitude to you. And I hope we can do more of these in the future as well. Hi, thank you so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.